Our religious people, we are here on this beautiful spring night, the first day of the month of May, and we're in a church praying because we all realize the most important task in life is, in the final moment, is to become one with God, to share God's life. And the word being saved means for all of us here that we are saved when at last we are completely in God, one with God, and He is found completely in us. We are almost identical to God in the resemblance to that. Now, this is everything that Jesus was trying to explain in his years in his public speaking, his preaching, explaining to thousands of people who gathered in large numbers, listening to his preaching, and many became his followers. He talks about that in the last sentence of this gospel, to grow the numbers. How does one become one with God? That's the meditation all through the year, especially in Easter time, because we're talking about a God who is risen from the dead, who is alive, permeating history, can't see him physically as we see each other, and yet he's moving history for 2,000 years without interruption. How do we become one with this God? Now, Jesus, when he preaches, has a very eloquent strategy. He uses very attractive examples to make his point, to demonstrate to the audience how it's possible for them to experience salvation. Much better to say, what does it mean to have salvation? So he takes examples to make their logic, tease their logic. He takes examples from the everyday life of his listeners. These are examples that they enjoy because he hits them right where their real world is. He deals with the work that they do every day in life to earn their living, to survive in the world. And of course, he uses images where they find fulfillment in living their life. He elevates that and says, if this makes sense to you, how much more will something greater make sense too? For example, the last week or so, we had this wonderful gospel where Jesus is explaining a way of looking at salvation when he uses the good shepherd image. Why is that powerful? Well, as the deacon said last week in the sermon, there are very few sheepfolds in Louisa County. I'm sure shepherding goes on in Virginia and many other parts of the world. So shepherding is distant from us. If Jesus was preaching right now, he'd use a different image. But to his audience, that was a major industry. You had to have a lot of lamb. The flocks were there. The lamb itself was the center of the Passover supper. The wool was important. And there was a relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. And so they're paying attention to him. Many deal with livestock in his lifetime. That's how they live. Real life shepherds do care for the flock. Well, the logic is, well, if I'm the good shepherd, do I care for you? Do you feel that? And the good shepherd, he says, goes further. He goes after the strays. They're not hirelings. Hirelings could care less. They're in it only for the money. Good shepherds protect the flock from the wolves, and good shepherds risk their lives for the sheep. Didn't take much for them to make the connection that if you're Jesus, if you're God, this is how you care for us. You're not a dictator bossing us around and pushing us. You attract us. You know us. You call each by name, almost as if a shepherd calls his sheep his pets. And now he uses another example. The night before he dies, he's trying to explain to them how they can live in him and he can live in them. So how does he do it? He uses food. Everyone needs food to survive. But more than that, in the Middle East, more so than today, we're kind of nuclear, where people don't always sit down at the table together. They're always moving around in shifts. But he says this: not only do we need food to survive, but in the Middle East, ancient world, to enjoy a meal with someone else was always meant to say that they belonged to one another in a certain way. It would be considered offensive because they didn't have all these McDonald's and Hardee's and restaurants, fast food, that when you had provided a meal, if someone around didn't have, you would invite them to the table with you. You would break bread with them. The family meal then even involves guests coming and so forth, to feel part of the larger family. And that still happens today when people have family reunions and stuff like that. Even the wedding feast, his first miracle, we're told, is at a wedding feast in Cana in Galilee. And so a lot of people are there. But any wedding reception, and I've done hundreds of weddings in my priesthood, it expands the family because suddenly you have a bride and a bridegroom. They have their separate families, and now in the marriage, the two families are kind of one family, and the reception is meant to celebrate celebrate, we're all at kind of one table with the newlyweds. At the Last Supper, the night before he dies, Jesus is feeding us with himself. That's the image. They make the springboard jump from saying, this isn't just matzah and a goblet of wine. You're giving us yourself. We belong to you. If you're a shepherd, we belong to you as your flock. You know, we belong to you now by sitting at the same table and dining with you. And of course, when they're dining with Jesus, realize at the time he sits at table, one of them has planned to betray him. The other one brags about never denying him and being disloyal. So even at the one, there are people who have problems, and yet he wants to use the meal to gather and pull them in. He wants them to know that he nourishes us no longer with earthly food, but with his body and blood, his very life. Those nice images, the meal, the shepherding. Now, we just listened to this gospel tonight. Christ is speaking. It happens during his long Last Supper. A Jewish Passover in those days was the whole evening. It wasn't just an hour and go home. There for a long time, he's speaking to 11 apostles because one of them had just left, the bad guy. And this is the night before he dies. He tells them another image from real life, not just sheep, or lambs and shepherds, the major industry for many, or fishing. Peter, Andrew, James, John, 4 of the apostles had successful fishing businesses there. And fresh live fish was a source of protein, part of the Hebrew diet. It's a good living. They like that. And he told the apostles the fishing image, you're going to be fishing men, gathering people in. That's how the gospel ends, becoming disciples, bearing fruit. So this time he chooses another occupation popular to his Hebrew audience, and actually going popular here. When I first came here as pastor down 605 Shannon Hill Road, there's a winery called Cooper Winery, and then they changed hands, and now it's called the 53 Winery. And I went by there one day and said, why did you call it 53? It doesn't sound very attractive, you know. Well, we were the 53rd vintner winery in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I said, okay, number 53, there it goes. It's a lot of wineries, okay? A lot of wine. Well, in Jesus' time, it's the same thing. In his audience, many people either worked on the farms and vineyards or owned it, and they had to ferment the grapes. Grapes are good fruit for kids, and wine gladdens the heart and the soul, as they say. It's also a much preferred beverage. Centuries later, when St. Benedict founds the order of monastic monks in Europe in the 5th century or whatever, he writes the holy rule. It's a very simple rule. They grow grapes. They make wine to earn their living in a monastery. They grow sheep, or harvest, I should say livestock sheep, to sell the wool. And of course, in the rule of Benedict, he tells the monks that part of their diet, they were vegetarians at the time, that they should have a liter of wine every day, not because they're alcoholics, because that was considered vitamins. That's your nourishment. The water doesn't carry the wine wood. They thought it had medicinal properties. So a vineyard, vine and branches, there's a science to that. Even many years ago when I was a high school teenager, I started growing grapes to see how it was, and I watched the Horton vineyards going out to Charlottesville, and they're following the old Cynefin method, they say, the agricultural experts. You have to reduce the vine so it's only going to go so high. It's only allowed to have 4 branches on the average, and they're only about 2 to 3 feet long. You control how the vine will grow so that you can force it to not have too many clusters, but the clusters of grapes you do have are richer, bigger, sweeter, and juicier. It's all a science there. And these guys all knew it. So everyone is paying attention when Jesus starts to talk about God, religion, belonging to him, using something they know so well. They know, though, the deeper, serious point that he's making. Vines have to bear fruit, or you're wasting your time. They have to yield grapes. And they do this, of course, by being pruned or trimmed, which means you do something violent. You don't let it grow wild. You have to control it. There it is. Prune vines increase the yield of grapes and intensify the flavor. The vintner always cuts off the dead branches. In fact, I was told that the branches that produce this year will never produce again. So they're always growing the 4 branches this year, and they have the stubs for next year's future branches planned to begin growing and producing a year later. It's a whole cycle there. Dead branches have to be cut off because they waste the energy of the entire vine and trunk. Now, everyone who's listening to Jesus is getting the point then. He's not really a horticulturist. He's a professional carpenter, but others know more about vineyards and farming maybe than he does. Yet there is something in this agricultural example of salvation. Because what he's trying to suggest through the vine and branches is this question about salvation, which means, how do you and I become a complete, full human person? When we're born, we're human. When we're conceived, we're human. But we're nearly not complete. We haven't grown up. We haven't lived our life and found our career identity. So what completes and fulfills me in this life? And the answer is implied in the vine and the branches. We have to belong to the vine with a capital V in the word vine. It's a person. And we are the branches. And his audience could make the connection. We are members of you. St. Paul would like to use the other example, the human body. The body has a head, it has a body, and it has limbs and members. Get the point. That's who Christ in the church is. We depend, though, on our source of nourishment, on Jesus himself, to nourish us with his life. That's the whole point. That's what you're doing right now here at church. If not, if we cut ourselves or sever ourselves off from the vine, we're not going to bear fruit. We will shrivel up, eventually disappear from the vine, and be extinguished. Jesus reminds his listeners, as every farmer of vines know, that a branch simply can't choose to separate or detach itself from the vine, to unplug itself from the vine for a while, and then choose to reattach itself to the vine. The branches have to be continuously inseparable from the trunk, inseparable from the main vine. If the branch is lopped off, or if it's broken off, it just can't go back to the vine and resume bearing fruit. And it's very hard to graft onto vines in those days. It's the same then with the great commitments we have in our life. Whether we commit ourselves to a very serious goal or not, if we interrupt it, if we quit, if we amputate ourselves from that commitment, it's often very difficult to return and pick up that commitment again. And some of the greatest commitments we make in life are the callings we get from God. One would be marriage. God designed marriage in paradise with Adam and Eve. It's intended to be a lifelong commitment. And so a person just can't simply interrupt marriage and go to somebody else and come back again, although many have tried. It's meant to be continuous to its final end. More so is the higher calling, baptism. The opening prayer mentioned that. That's when we were grafted or brought to the vine, made branches on it in the beginning of our faith. That's a calling that comes directly from God to us. He invites us at baptism and through the other sacraments to share our life with him, to share it now and to share it always without stopping or interrupting it. So once we say yes to God's call, we must never cut ourselves off from God. To do so can make us barren, unfruitful, dull, and lifeless. I feel, this is my opinion, that people who cut themselves off from the vine of God become very boring people, and they tend to fill their lives up with a lot of nonsense, superficial things. Notice the first words that Jesus used as the gospel started. It almost was simply said and forgotten. He didn't say, I am the vine. He did say, I am the true vine. That's the key word. People can choose to belong to many so-called vines in this life, in this world, to many institutions and clubs and organizations, and they're all good. But none of them can give life without end. Only Christ can give us this life. But Christ here means that he's not just the one true vine that lasts forever. He is. More than that, he means that he is the very source of truth itself. And that's the problem that bothers a lot of people in the world today, is how do we know what are the truths? Jefferson's famous phrase in the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Tom Jefferson, where do self-evident truths come from? Not from Congress, they come from God. And they even said that, and so forth. Active faith there, beautiful declaration. Everything in life that has meaning and that can stabilize human life and keep its identity and protect its quest for fulfillment It can only happen if it's conveying God's truth to us about everything in life, justice, what true justice is, morality, and so on. You can't just choose your morality here and there selectively. When we then belong to Jesus fully and never separating ourselves from him, only then will we begin to have him impart into us the truth about who God is and how God belongs to us. Only then will we behave in a way that expresses the love and respect that we're also called to show one another. Notice how St. John the Apostle said it in the second reading tonight. He said, let us love, to the first Christians. He calls them children because he's a very old apostle. And these are adults, but he's their spiritual father. They're his children. Let us love, not in word or speech. There's a lot of talk out there, but in deed and in truth, in action and truth, true actions. There are many people today who claim to be a branch on the vine who is Christ. And that's what annoys us, people who claim, oh, I'm Christian or I'm Catholic or something. They talk a lot about it, but their actions speak differently. They will never bear fruits. We belong to the Lord. This is why we were here at this moment tonight, because as John said, we are also keeping his commandments. And if we can keep his commandments, we remain in him and he remains in us. And this is also more convincing during this great pandemic, almost 14 months since the lockdown and social distancing. Many people still are not comfortable coming to Mass. Many more are doing it. Thank God for the vaccine, which encourages that. But whether you're near or far, whether you're watching this now on the live stream, or you've been away for more than a year, you're still part of the vine. You are a branch on it, If you cannot be here physically, you are certainly here by your intentions spiritually. You remain in Christ, he remains in you. And so we are present tonight at this sacrament, which is the meal. The Lord feeds us, though, with himself. So it's more than a meal. And yet we all know, as the people who are far from us here, that whether we are near or far, we are still branches on that vine. Notice how the gospel ended with the results of what it means to bear fruit. Jesus says, my Father enjoys the fact that you have remained on the vine in becoming my disciples. And we had that lovely, interesting first reading from the Acts of the Apostles. Paul and Barnabas. Paul begins the little excerpt with a reminder that he had a bad past. This is a man who should never have been apostle if you judge him by worldly standards. He was persecuting Christians. Stephen was one of them, and others were included. He was a known executioner because he worked for his Jewish confreres, his allies. Jesus meets him, converts him, and through his holy baptism, he becomes a very strong branch on the vine. Paul produces much fruit with his confrere Barnabas, also numbered among the apostles. And as the reading goes down there, Paul now turns everything upside down. That's how the vine bears fruit. He preaches fearlessly and intelligently in the synagogues. That's where he used to practice his rabbinical profession, in synagogues. That's the first place he hits. That's the first place he gets converts. Many people are upset with the competition between this new faith in a risen Christ, the vine, and their traditional faith. So they throw him out. They cause trouble. And so Paul is kind of snatched away and goes somewhere else. But it says they rejoiced in the fact they were called to suffer because of some stress. Christ is still trimming and pruning the vine. And it ends, though, that reading from Acts like the gospel, many people, though, decided to make the choice. They, too, want to be branches on the vine. So who they are in the past, we are those branches today at this moment.